Hello, it's Gail here from Three Wise Crafters and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I created this card using new products from Altenew's June release, including the Sunkissed Blooms 3D embossing folder, the coordinating colouring stencils, and Spellbinders curved everyday sentiments, which includes two hot foil plates of sentiments, and then there is a coordinating die to use to cut out all your sentiments with. I have a 6-inch square card panel here, which is Kraft Distress Heavy Stock, and I'm going to run my embossing folder through my Spellbinders die cutting machine. I did need to use a paper shim as the Altenew embossing folder is thinner than the Spellbinders. And here you can see all of the dimension that the embossing folder creates on our card panel, and this makes it easier to line up our stencils with. So there's 5 stencils in this set, and they're all numbered from 1 to 5 as you can see here. Altenew also includes a colouring guide for easy reference, with some suggested ink colours up the top left-hand corner there. And each stencil is shown with all the ink colours and where it goes. So here I'm just using Express It removable tape runner to apply some adhesive to the back of the card panel, and then I'll adhere that to my Wendy Vecchi Make Art station. I just like the double security of extra tape rather than just relying on the magnets. So Lawn Fawn Yeti ink and a foam dome blending tool are used next, and that just makes it easier to apply that pigment ink to our card panel. And it's really easy to apply the pigment ink with the blending tool rather than using a blending brush. Your bristles will end up getting clogged with the pigment ink, and you won't be able to use that blending brush for anything else but white pigment ink. So once we've finished all of the pigment ink on our first stencil, we'll be able to clean off our stencil, and I'll show you how I do that. So here I've just got rubbing alcohol in a spray bottle that I get from my local supermarket, and there's also a bigger bottle which I use a funnel to refill my spray bottle with. And I've just sprayed that onto a stencil and just using a soft cloth to rub that pigment ink off. And it's really easy to clean, and the stencil is dry and able to be reused straight away. So here I have stencil number 2, and I'm just doing the same technique as stencil 1, applying that pigment ink with a blending tool, and we'll end up skipping ahead here. So pigment ink makes it easier for our dye ink to be seen, otherwise it tends to soak straight through to the Kraft Cardstock if we apply it directly. And the colours will end up being muted, or you won't be able to see them at all depending on what colours you use. So you really need to use a white or ivory pigment ink if you're doing this technique. So here you can see all of the stencils have been completed and what the pigment ink looks like on our card panel. So here I'm using chamomile crisp dye ink from Altenew, which is part of the Golden Sunset range, and a mini detailed ink blending brush, which I've had in my supplies for a long time. So I'll have all the details of the supplies used in this video in the description below, so make sure that you check that out as well. So I end up applying the chamomile ink to all the little flowers on our card panel, and I'm just masking off the area here because I didn't want the chamomile ink to end up in a hibiscus flower, which is directly below. And some of the flowers are close together. And I really liked how this looked on the finished card. I wasn't too sure at this stage how it was going to look because it looked quite muted when I was doing the ink blending on the Kraft cardstock. And sometimes that can happen, and it's not until you actually lift up your stencil that you get to see what it does look like. Now you need to let your pigment ink dry. If you don't, when you apply your dye ink over the top, it will take off some of that pigment ink, and then you'll lose the color vibrancy when it soaks straight through into your Kraft cardstock. So here I've skipped ahead a bit because it is the same process for all of the ink blending for these little flowers. And I do create some shading with another ink color, which you'll see very soon as well. So here I'm using Snapdragon to create that ink blending or shading on our little flowers here. Now these flowers you can look up on the internet for different color suggestions, and you could have used these ink color combinations too on the hibiscus and done these little flowers in a completely different color for a totally different effect. So you just use what ink colors you have in your stash, and you'll come up with something no matter what inks you have. There is that many images on the internet with these flowers and hibiscus that your color combinations are really endless for this card using this embossing folder and the stencils. You could also do some fussy cutting as well and have a bit of flexibility then with the embossing folder and the orientation of it. So here we're nearly finished with the marigold ink and just adding that shading to these bottom yellow flowers here. And then we'll be on to our hibiscus flowers, which I'm going to use sort of pink tones today on mine. I really like using pink for some reason, and I do need to push myself out of my comfort zone and start using some other ink colors. So I'm not sure if you have the same problem, whether you tend to go for the same ink colors all the time or whether you do mix it up. So feel free to drop me a comment below and let me know whether you do use the same colors or whether you do change it up a bit. So sometimes this was a little bit heavier, sometimes it was a little bit lighter, and that's okay. So now I'm using mauve, which is from the Dried Petals Fresh Dye Ink range at Altenew. And I just have the mini ink cubes because then I need less storage space, but also because it's cheaper on my budget. So I apply the mauve with a mini ink blending brush and I apply that to the whole petal, and then that'll allow me to create some shading with other inks within that same ink set of the dried petals. And I'm just masking off here. As I said earlier, these flowers are quite close to each other, and I don't want to get pink in with the yellow orange parts, and likewise I don't want the yellows to mix with the pink. So here I've got Berry Licious, which will create a second layer of shading. And I apply this to 2/3, maybe 3/4 of our flower petals on the hibiscus. And then I will come in with a third color to create some additional shading down at the base of our petals. So you could also use Distress Oxide inks on here without doing the pigment ink. But I find it's harder to create shading using oxide inks. You might find it different, but that's just how I find it. So I do prefer to use the pigment ink and then apply ink color over the top. I don't tend to use Kraft Cardstock very much, but it is a technique now that I do enjoy doing, and I do like the effect that it has on the Kraft Cardstock. So here we're using acacia berry to just apply at the base of our hibiscus flowers just to create that extra shading that would be inside our hibiscus flowers. And I really liked how all of this came together at the end. I wasn't too sure on some of the ink colors that I chose, but I did end up coming to like it. And I'll explain a little bit more a bit further on as to what colors I wasn't sure about. And that was more to do with my leaves. So once we're finished the ink blending, you'll be able to see how this first stencil looks. And I really like how this is starting to take effect on our Kraft cardstock. So I've got stencil 2 down, and I am just using the exact same colors for the hibiscus, which is the mauve, berry licious, and acacia berry from the dried petals fresh dye ink range. And it's exactly the same techniques. So I haven't included all of the ink blending. I decided to leave it at normal speed rather than speed up the ink blending and include it all. Um, Given that it is exactly the same technique, you see it once, you don't really need to see it again. So here you can see I've applied all the color to the hibiscus, and I'm just finishing up with the snapdragon on our little yellow flowers here. And once we take this stencil off, you can really see how our card is coming together. There's 3 stencils for the flowers, and then there's 2 stencils for the leaves. And I did find doing the stamen for the hibiscus was a little bit difficult, but I'll go through that a bit later. So here we've onto our 3rd stencil, and I really enjoy using embossing folders and stencils. I don't do it enough, but I really enjoyed how easy it was to create this card. And if you had done just a white card panel instead and embossed that, applying your ink would have been much easier, much quicker, and you could batch make these easy. So I've got the shading part for our hibiscus, and I ended up using a red blending brush for the acacia berry just because it was a darker color. And you could have got away with the pink, but for some reason, I ended up using the red, and I didn't mind using the red blending brush. It doesn't matter at the end of the day as long as you keep to a similar color family. So here I'm just applying the chamomile to our flowers, and then I'll apply the snapdragon as well. So I think I end up skipping ahead here as well. But let me know if you've used embossing folders before with stencils. And if you have, how did you find it? Did you find it easy or did you find it difficult? And if you need to create a card quickly, what's your go-to technique? What do you do? I tend to go for stencils a fair bit. Die cutting can take some time, so I tend to just pick up my stencils and color with those. I also find it's really relaxing, so I might end up either stamping or embossing a lot of card panels and have them ready to go, and then I'll just create different colored card panels with the same supplies, and you can create completely different effects with those. You can trim them down and create a completely different card style. The versatility of products nowadays is really endless. It's only up to our imagination. So you got a glimpse there of what all of the flowers looked like, and now I'm on to our leaves. So on this stencil, there are the 2 stamens as well, and that is marked with an etching on the stencil. And I'm just using eucalyptus here. And it was this green family of ink, and this is the Frosted Foliage Fresh Dye ink set, and I wasn't sure how this was going to look. I have used this before on white and I liked the color, but I wasn't sure on the Kraft cardstock, especially with the next ink cube that I use. So I wasn't 100% sure whether I liked it. So this is the forest fern, and this sort of, when you apply it over the eucalyptus, it gives it more of a bluey green, but actually came to quite like it. When the card was finished and I could see all of the ink blending completed with the other leaves, I really liked how it turned out. So you could have done this with a completely different green ink cube set, and you would have, or the round ones, and you would have had a completely different look on your card when you finished it. So here, I liked that. I wasn't too sure initially, but I did end up liking it. So here I'm trying to do the stamens, and I am using, I think it is marigold for the stamens. And I wasn't too sure on whether I liked this or not. It was hard to line up the stencil with the colored ink that I used, so I did offset it a little bit, but it's not too obvious that that happened. But when I lifted this up, I wasn't really keen on the coloring. So I did end up going in with the acacia berry that was left on my blending brush, just to tone down that marigold as that was on our hibiscus. I didn't really like how vibrant that was. And then I think I ended up going back in as well with the berry licious to tone it down even a bit more at the top of the stamen on that top right hibiscus flower. And then I didn't mind it as much then. It sort of toned in a little bit more with the hibiscus instead of standing out and sort of hitting you in the face when you looked at it. And then I just applied a little bit of Sunray ink to the stamen ends. And while it looks very vibrant on camera, on the finished card, it's not as obvious and it doesn't stand out as much. It is toned down a little bit. So I found the stamen was probably the hardest part on all of the ink blending to do. So just bear with it if you experience any difficulties as well. So here I'm using jade, and I later realized that I should have actually used silver sage first, sorry. But I ended up putting down the jade and then realized that it was the second color in the family and that the silver sage should have been done first as it's a lighter color. I ended up going over the top of these leaves with the silver sage, and then I ended up doing a bit more jade, and I didn't mind how it ended up looking. So here you can see the silver sage. So you can fix things a little bit, but it just depends on what ink colors you do use. So putting the silver sage over the top of the jade actually created a darker area, which I didn't know whether that would happen or not. And you can see here I'm just checking to see what it looks like because I just realized that I had done the second shade first instead of doing the silver sage. So then you'll end up seeing me going in with the another color as well, which is the eucalyptus, and I really liked the effect that this had on these leaves and the stems. So you just play around with your ink colors. What I am slowly doing is making some ink swatches just because I can never remember what the shading's going to look like when I'm ink blending because it's different to when you stamp it. You get a different tone of shade. So I am making myself some swatches and I'll share those one day when I've got them finished. So I just apply that eucalyptus to the leaves and to the stems in different areas. but not to all areas. You'll see here that I go in with the forest fern as well, and I just apply some extra shading to the flower stems and the leaves on our small flowers. And that just gives us that two-tone effect and the different leaf colors. Now here you can see all the ink blending's been done, and I really loved how this looked. And I've trimmed my 6-inch card panel down to 5 1/4 squares. So here I've got Nina Solar White, and I've trimmed that down to 10.5 inches by 5 1/4. And I just score that in half at the 5 1/4 mark with the bone folder. And here I've got a folder where I have some die cuts of sentiments all ready to go. And I am using the From Me to You, which I have gold foiled with Glimmer Gold hot foil. And it's really easy to do some sentiments as a batch making process. If you're not sure what to create, just sit and create some sentiments and create the style that you use. So here I've just applied Gina K Connect glue that I have in a fine tip bottle to the back of our card panel, and I'm just applying that to our card base, and I stick down the left hand corner and line up the folded edge, and I just find that that makes it easier to line up our card panel. You could have done this in your score body or your stamping platform and lined it up easy as well. So here I have some mini squares, and I think these are 2 mil thick, and I'm just placing these on the back of our sentiment. And once I've taken off all the backing pieces, I do apply a bit of Connect glue to the foam squares, just because there is dimension on our card panel that we're adhering our sentiment to, and we want it to stick. So I was going to place the sentiment there where the yellow flowers were, but I decided it was taking away too much from the flowers, and just moving up a little bit, there was a bit of a gap, which allowed me to place my sentiment down onto my card. So I really loved how this looked, and I hope that you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, make sure to give it a big thumbs up and to subscribe to the channel while you're there. All the supplies listed or used in today's video are listed in the description below, so make sure that you check that out. Thank you so much for watching.